Hi, I'm Katy Armstrong. I'm the Hub Lead for Flying High English Hub, and welcome to this podcast. Today, we're thinking all about reading for pleasure and how we can get that into our schools. We know from research that children who choose to read for pleasure have more successful futures, and we want that for every child. So what are the strategies that we can use to try and get our children to read? We know particularly at home, we're fighting against screens and other distractions. So how can we encourage children to choose by their own volition to pick up a book and read it, not because their teacher or their parents have told them to? There are lots of strategies that schools can use, and I'm joined today by the fabulous Kelly Ashley, who is a researcher for the Open University, who's going to share lots of strategies and hints and tips that we can use in our classrooms, as well as at home if you're a parent, to try and get your children to choose to read. So before we jump into anything else, Kelly, I'm really interested to know, how did you get into this role? How did you start being a researcher into reading for pleasure?
Oh, well, I started my initial teaching career in the late 90s, if I should admit that, in the States. And I've always been really passionate about reading and the power of reading. I still remember the first book that I read aloud to my very first class was Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. And I remember the reaction and the joy and the tears and just the power that reading could have. So I've always loved reading and been really interested in it. I then came across Professor Teresa Kremen's research, the Teachers as Readers research, which I found really interesting and provocative, especially around the knowledge required by teachers, knowledge of text and knowledge of readers, and the different things we could do in the classroom to support reading for pleasure. And that sparked my interest further. I then saw they were advertising, this is going back about 6-7 years ago, for United Kingdom, Open University, UKLA teacher reading group leaders. And so what I did is I put myself forward and started running a teacher reading group. And that helped to connect me in the community and get to know lots of the wonderful people. And I ran a group for 2 years, and that was just fantastic. And through that, there was then a position that opened up. And I thought, what could be better than working with Professor Teresa Kremen and the other researchers and the rest of the team to really focus on this passion of mine, which is reading for pleasure and making sure that all children have the chances that they want to have. And it spiraled from there, really. Working on the team, we have a range of opportunities to engage in different types of research on reading and why we like to read, or why we choose to read, or why we don't. Of course, we work with other researchers across the UK and internationally, which is always really exciting to see what else is going on. And of course, working on the many programs like the OU UKLA teacher reading groups, which I know you run one in the local area. And then also our year-long programs, our reading schools program for primary and secondary, and other programs that we run across. So it's quite an exciting role, and really essential to keep that agenda front and center.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And have you found that you've got more schools over the last couple of years coming and wanting to develop their knowledge in reading for pleasure?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think we had the early reading framework that was released in 2021, which gave us somewhat more of an idea of what some of those elements of reading for pleasure could look like. Because it was always in the curriculum. It's always in the 2014 curriculum, but it wasn't necessarily prioritized. And I think
also skimmed over, and we missed that little bit.
It was part of the curriculum, but kind of a nice add-on. Whereas what we know is that reading for pleasure needs to be central. So I think since the early reading framework came out in 2021, and then the most recent one several years later, looking at the older years, especially into secondary, it's been much more of a priority. And the fact that people know that it's not something that just happens, and there are things that we can do intentionally to be strategic and to strengthen that reading culture.
Yeah, and I think being strategic is what schools really need, isn't it? I know lots of schools talk to us about having that end of the day story for everybody up to year 6 in primary. We all get a story, so we're doing reading for pleasure, and we do World Book Day every year, so we're doing it. But it's more than that, isn't it? There's more elements to reading for pleasure than just reading aloud to your children.
Absolutely. I mean, there's much more involved in that. And there's much more, what that starts with is understanding the research behind what is reading for pleasure in the first place. And reading for pleasure in its simplest sense is choice and habit. So I want to do something, and then because I want to do it and I'm enjoying it and my friends are doing it, or my family or my adult role models are doing it and encouraging me, I'm in those supportive environments, it becomes a habit. And the more that I do it, the more that I want to do it. Yeah. So it's kind of like me and, for instance, going for a walk every day. I should do that every day. I know it's really good. I know I should. I know it's good for me. I know the benefits, just like we know the benefits of reading for pleasure. It can improve vocabulary. It can even improve mathematics, attainment, comprehension. There is a correlational relationship rather than causational, but we do know that reading for pleasure can benefit attainment. There's those relational connections. So I think schools are more aware of the benefits, but actually, how do we gently nudge children into those spaces where, like me, not wanting to go for a walk every day, but knowing I should, how am I going to motivate myself? Because that's how we get the lifelong readers, the habitual readers, the ones who choose, the ones who can benefit from those cognitive, relational, and social benefits that I just mentioned.
So how can we motivate children? I know lots of schools have stickers and reward schemes and things, but it's that intrinsic motivation we need, isn't it, to make children want to do it as a lifelong reader. So what can schools do to get the children to want to be motivated to read?
I think that's a really good question. And I'm particularly interested in myself as a researcher in reader identity and motivation, and how our own personal interests and drivers can help to motivate us or demotivate us, as it might be. Professor Teresa Kremen wrote a great article for the National Association for Teachers of English for their Primary Matters magazine in 2019 around reading motivation. And she shared this visual triangle that talks about different kinds of motivation that we can have as readers. One of them is, as you've mentioned, the intrinsic. So I want to do it because it's something I'm interested in. I'm driven from inside. There's the extrinsic, which is, okay, I will do it, but I'm doing it because someone else is asking me to, or because I'm getting a reward or a sticker or a prize. But then also there's that social motivation. So if I'm part of that community that is socially supportive, that reading for pleasure culture, that reading for pleasure community, that's really going to bolster my motivation. So I've actually recently written a piece around motivation as well, based on what Teresa had written previously. And I always like a metaphor. So the way I like to describe it is different kinds of power. Okay, so when you're thinking of extrinsic motivation, you're thinking of mains power. So we have to plug it in. Okay, so if I want the light to work, I have to plug it in. It's the same with extrinsic. And those things can be really good in the short term. They can give us a short-term power boost. They can give us they can re-energize our readers if their interest is waning, or if you want to introduce them to something new. But what happens when we unplug it? It goes. Okay, so extrinsic can't be the only thing. Likewise, the social is fantastic, but that is your power grid. And the more children, adults, families that we have part of our reading culture, understanding the power of it, the more power source that we have to draw on. So you're always wanting to strengthen your power grid. Ultimately, I like to liken intrinsic motivation to solar power. So it's that power, that light from within. And if you think about solar power, if we're not in the right conditions, it won't flourish. So even children who, we see this a lot, moving from perhaps infant to junior or from primary to secondary school, their interest in reading starts to wane. Their solar power starts to be depleted. And that's where those other kinds of power can work together to really bolster that support. So I think that motivation is really key, and something that we need to think about in terms of, what are we doing, and are we motivating in enough different ways to build that power grid to kind of strengthen that internal solar power. And every now and again, we might need a bit of a temporary boost, things like World Book Day, or, you know, an author of the month, or some kind of a readathon challenge. Those things can work in the short term, but it's thinking about that ultimate goal.
Yeah. I love that metaphor. I think that's great. The idea of a little plug-in boost that can be, you know, get us thinking a little bit more, but it's not enough to keep you going all the time. I think that's great.
Yeah.
I do like a metaphor. It means you can picture it and think about what it looks like.
I always like things that are really complicated. I always try and simplify. They're always like, oh, come on, Kelly, you got another metaphor for us on the team, because I know I'm metaphor lady. But yeah, I do like a metaphor because it makes more difficult things simpler to understand.
So for the school community then, we want to get that, what did you call it? The power grid.
The power grid.
How can we encourage that in schools? Because I know, particularly in schools that I've worked in myself, we've had teams where some staff are really into reading and they know lots of children's books. Some staff not quite as much, and getting them on board is trickier. So then you sometimes get, if you're in the right class, the children get motivated. If you're in the other class, maybe not quite as much. How can we make that a school-wide thing where we get those conditions right?
I think the first thing is educating, building that knowledge of the staff, not only of what reading for pleasure is, it's that choice and it's that habit. And what's the difference between reading for pleasure, or the will to read, as it's often called, and reading skill. So your fluency, your comprehension, your phonics, which both of them are very important. And actually they complement each other. So I think it's helping staff to understand what is reading for pleasure and how does it fit within this wider reading offer. Yeah. Then it's thinking about, okay, one of your biggest tools that you can use in a school to really motivate perhaps some staff who are a bit reluctant, or maybe I often hear, well, I don't really have time to read books, or I don't have time to update myself. I think once they see the power of knowing children, knowing who they are and their identities and what they like to read, it's an absolute game changer. Yeah. They can see that they can make a connection with that child. They can open themselves up as an adult to what they like to read. The child will talk more to them. And the power of those conversations is big. So I'd say that's the first step, is boosting that knowledge. So the first findings of the Teachers as Readers research, which was originally 2009, but was published officially in the book, Building Communities book, in 2014. It said that we want to, first of all, build teachers' knowledge of texts and teachers' knowledge of readers. But interestingly, what we find in working with schools is it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. Yeah. Do we want to build our knowledge of readers so that we can tailor our knowledge of text to what they want to read? Or do we start by building knowledge of texts and then find out what children like to read? And I think those decisions are based on schools and where they are, because everyone's at a different point in their journey. Yeah. Everyone's tried different strategies with reading for pleasure, but whole school strategy isn't easy. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It doesn't happen overnight. Yeah.
I think they both feed into each other though, don't they, as well? You know, I know when I was in the classroom, I'd have read a book and recommend it to a child and they go, oh, I've also read this one, miss, do you want this one? So they would grow my knowledge of texts, knowing that I'd enjoyed something that they'd enjoyed. It's not just a one-way street, is it? Exactly. It can be through lots of different avenues that we can expand our knowledge of text as well as knowledge of the children and what they enjoy.
If you imagine in a classroom, there are a myriad reader to reader networks, so reading networks. So it might be between the teacher and a child who both enjoy reading books about, I don't know, football. Or it might be a little group of children over here who are just reading the latest Aaron Blabby Bad Guys book and their little graphic novel club. Or you might have a group who really like Anjali Rauf and they've read her books and they're absolutely transfixed with a particular author. So I think once we reposition ourselves, not as teacher, pupil, but in a reading for pleasure space as reader and reader, those networks, those kind of tendrils can spread in all different directions. And it's tapping into where the networks are that are already strong, but also observing, listening, watching, how do they choose in the library? Do they talk about their reading or not? Do the adults talk about their reading? Where are the little threads where you can kind of twig the thread to kind of spark that network with someone else? And I think all that comes with building knowledge in the first place. And that's before we even begin to build some of the practice strategies that you can do in the classroom. So knowledge first.
So what are the other strategies we can use? And so we've got our staff, they've got knowledge of all the books that are available, that, constantly coming out gorgeous titles. They know all the children really well in their class, so they can do that matching. What strategies do we then need to promote more reading for pleasure?
So one of the things that you would do after that, you feel that knowledge is on the way and has been developed, is you're wanting to develop a very clear social reading environment. So the social reading environment encompasses the physical spaces, but also that's thinking about the school and the location. So I live in North Yorkshire. There's lots of really tiny little schools. I've been in a school where the library is in the coat cupboard. I've been in schools that have their own dedicated libraries, multiple libraries across multiple sites. Wow. It just depends on the size and the context of the school. So it's physical spaces. Where can not just books, but reading be celebrated and shared? In the classrooms, in the corridors, in the head teacher's office. So it's those physical spaces, but also thinking about what types of materials are being shared, what types, because sometimes as adults, we can promote books that we think, well, this is what we should be reading, and there is a place for that. Absolutely. When we're building skills, we want them to be reading certain books to build the skills, to develop that skill as they're moving along.
Challenging level during the teaching to develop the comprehension, but that's not necessarily what it needs to be for reading for pleasure.
Absolutely. So you want to think, do we have magazines? Do we have recipe books? Do we have leaflets? Do we have Match Tack, What on Earth magazine, the Beano? Do we have audio books? Do we have ebooks? Are there a range of different ways that children can explore? So the social environment encompasses the physical spaces. So I would say once you've developed the knowledge, do a bit of a trawl of your physical spaces. If I was walking into your school for the first time, what reading spaces could I physically see? Then once I saw the spaces, I would think, what happens in those spaces? So the physical and the social. Are they interactive? Are there people talking about books? Are they choosing? Are they selecting? Are they recommending? Are there peer recommendations? Are there teacher recommendations? Are the collections curated based on the children's interests? And in the best situations, are the children themselves curating and developing those spaces? Do they have ownership? So I think social reading spaces, who owns them, who curates them, and how do those physical spaces encourage that social interaction? And some of the best social spaces I'm seeing aren't the most beautiful book displays. It might just be a few little magazines in a corner that really catches a group. And remember those networks we talked about earlier? You can see straight away, ping, there's a little thread. And all of a sudden you have a little group of children who want to read about in a football magazine. Just talking about magazines, some really interesting findings. So I'm just in the middle of a longitudinal research on magazine engagement and reading for pleasure, working with What on Earth magazine. And it's so interesting, the social nature of using something like a magazine where multiple children have a shared text but aren't being taught skills or asked particular questions, but just being left free to explore the magazines and the connection and the conversation that they have through those materials. So it's giving them those spaces for those things to thrive. So the social spaces would come next. And after that, naturally leads in things like reading aloud, story time, book chat, independent reading time or choice-led reading time. Some of those other practices that are everyday practices, but with a reading for pleasure lens overlaid.
Okay. I was going to ask you that actually. In terms of things like reading aloud, obviously we'd like that to happen every day. What about timings with children reading on their own, having that time? Is it recommended that you have a a chunk of time every day for the children to read? Obviously, what timetables is one of the things that schools say to us, how tight everything is to fit things in. Is there an ideal number of times that they should be allowing children to read over the week on their own or socially?
I think that's a really good question. And the schools that we work with, for instance, the primary and the secondary schools that we work with on the Reading Schools program, which is similar to some of the programs that you run through the English Hub.
We have the Transforming Schools Reading program.
And you'll see this as well through your TSRC program, is it really varies in how schools like to do it. A lot of schools, depending on where they're starting from, they like to dedicate some protected time in the timetable for reading for pleasure. And within that space, across the week, you might have story time sessions, book chat sessions, recommending sessions, independent leathering session, choice-led, going to the library. So I think it really varies. I think it's important for it to be regular. I think it's important for children to see that this is a time and a space that's valued. It's also about where it fits within the day. So sometimes you'll know, like I do, when I was in the classroom, end of the day, it's dropping off. We have to give out letters or give news announcements or whatever it is.
Definitely.
So it's having a dedicated time in the timetable, but protecting it and valuing it and letting the children see that that's valued. In terms of choice-led reading time, that independent reading time, or you might call it dear time or Eric time, or I've heard about 15 different names for it. That time when children are choosing and reading, it doesn't have to be silent. There might be times in there that it is silent because some children do like silence. I know for myself, if I'm reading a really intense thriller novel, it has to be quiet because I have to focus. If I'm reading,
if somebody's talking in the background, it puts you out.
Whereas if it's I'm reading a magazine or something else, it's like whatever TV can be on. So I think it's important to get that balance. But those spaces where you have that dedicated time every week where children can choose, they can read, they can chat, they can read aloud to each other. Those are the spaces in which they rehearse those habits that we talked about of a reader. And if we give them time and space regularly to do that in school, then those habits will hopefully be taken into the home situation as well. We want them to feel comfortable on what it means to be a reader and what do readerly behaviors look like, and what might that look like if I was to do that at home. So giving them that time to rehearse and to practice and to model in school, reader to reader, is really important.
And I think the role of the teacher there is really important as well, isn't it? If we're valuing this time, we're not sitting marking the maths books from this morning, we're getting involved with the children, we're modelling reading ourselves or having a bit of book chat with the children about what they're reading. Are there any tips you can give for teachers? Because I know, particularly as a less experienced teacher, if my children were supposed to be reading and they weren't quiet, I'd be wondering what we were talking about. So is there anything that we can do as teachers to really help those situations when the children are reading socially?
Yeah, I think having that time in the timetable, especially for newer teachers, almost frees you up to know that I don't need to be looking for assessment points here or checking understanding, that this is time to connect. And definitely through the magazine research, what we did is we had half an hour every week just for the magazine. And the teachers on that study said it was really nice to free up and just to be able to sit and to read and to chat. So I think sometimes it's being kind to yourself, but also the value of that time in sitting and listening and observing what the children would do, as we would do in any early years practice. What are the children doing? How are they interacting? How are they reading? Like a fly on the wall. What are they choosing? How do they choose a book? Do they just kind of scan the shelves and pick any old book out? Do they look at the blurb? Do they do a flick through? Do they have any particular behaviors, or are there certain books or certain types of text that they go to all the time? All those little nuggets of information are things that we can store away, not to mark on an observation sheet or to store away for, assessment purposes, but logging it in your mind as a reader of, right, I can then go and follow up and have a conversation with that child. And those moments are so valuable because ultimately, that nudging I talked about earlier on, we can't nudge if we're not connected with them. And that's really quite important.
Yeah, and I think that's got to come from the head teachers and the ethos of the school, hasn't it, as well? Knowing that it's okay to just sit and look at what your children are doing and know who's been a jack in a box and is changing the book every 5 minutes because they've not chosen the right one, who has always got the same book, and what can we do to expand their repertoire. I think, yeah, like I say, it's part of that school culture, isn't it, of knowing that it's all right for me to, we're so used to being busy as teachers, it's okay for me to just observe and see what's happening rather than be having to do something or have a conversation as well.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with having a strategic approach. It's a strategic approach. It's a shared approach and a shared understanding by everyone, SLT, teachers, support staff, parents, children. Everyone understands what we're trying to achieve. Not only, what we're doing and how we're doing it, but why it's really important. Why do we value reading for pleasure as a school? And what you've said there, having senior leaders on board is so important.
Yeah.
And understanding that the reading curriculum is both skill and will. Skills are so important. And will is also really important.
Yeah.
Because the more they want to read, the more they choose to read, the better their skills will become.
Yeah.
Because the more we do something, the more we rehearse it, the more we practice it, the better we get at it over time. And that's where reading for pleasure really comes into its own in terms of supporting that journey of development, both emotionally, relationally, and in terms of academic achievement as well.
Yeah. Just sort of going back to what you were saying earlier about physical environments.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of schools, obviously some schools don't have space for a library. Some schools are lucky enough to have a big library with lots and lots of books in that maybe not used very well. How can we encourage schools to use the spaces that they've had? And again, I know there's lots of teachers that have spent lots of holiday times making beautiful areas that aren't necessarily touched because it's there to look beautiful rather than being a space that we actually interact in, or it's so tiny that we can't actually get into do any reading. How can we encourage schools to use the spaces to the most impact?
Yeah, I think there are some really good suggestions, of course, in the reading framework for physical spaces, library spaces, but also Schools Library Association, SLA, and the Great School Libraries Report and others offer some really practical guidance and tools. Things like, how are your books? Are they forward facing? Do we feature certain books at different times? Who decides which books are forward facing? How are the books categorized? Do the children know how to find the books that they want? Do we ever ask them what they want? One of the schools who was involved with us in the Reading Schools program last year, I had the pleasure of going to visit this school in Durham last term, and they had a complete rehaul of the library, took all the books out, looked through, and talked to their reading ambassadors, their reading librarians. What is it that you want to see in your library? And they reorganized it together with the children.
Lovely.
They have a graphic novels section. They have an author of the month feature. They have novels organized alphabetically, but then non-fiction titles organized by theme with magazines scattered in, forward facing. And the children were so invested in this space and who owns this space. It does take time, but the more invested they are, the more likely they are to use that space.
Yeah.
And if you can get those champions, those ambassadors, those reading librarians, those little people who are going to constantly encourage you and their peers and be part of that team, that peer motivation is so powerful as well.
Absolutely. Now, I found in one of my classes, targeting the right child to get them reading often then would spread it through the friendship group rather than trying to target everybody. If you had one particular child that was sort of the cool guy in the group or whoever it was, if you get them on board, that peer pressure does happen really successfully, doesn't it, with reading, that makes children want to do the same as their friends.
It's something really interesting from research that shows that if you think of adult influence, whether that be a teacher or someone in the community, perhaps a religious figure in the community, or support assistant at school, or a family member, you think of an adult influence and you think of a peer influence. When children are in reception, so early years, that adult influence is king, really. And the adults will be much more influential in those early years, whereas peers, not as prevalent in terms of, I mean, it's still there, still an influence, but as they move through and then they start to get into year 5, year 6, and into secondary school, it almost starts to flip-flop. So the peer influence becomes king. And the adult influence is still really important. It's still there. It's still steadily, we're still encouraging, being reading teachers, modeling our own reading behaviors. But that's where that shared power grid is really important, because it's not just the adults who need to be on board. We need to find ways to gather, to support those readers, those most reluctant, the most disenfranchised, the ones that have never picked up a book or have never seen themselves as a reader. What can we do to really get those children on board? And how do we get them on board? Talk to them. Get them involved, make them your reading ambassadors, give them a purpose, make them shine. And that's really going to help them to make their mark in that space.
Yeah, I think getting them on board as a reading ambassador is a great idea. And I've seen that in a few schools that we've worked with, where the children that are more reluctant have had that role and taken it really seriously. And they've really become readers themselves and then helped spread that message. What else can we do for children that are reluctant readers to get them involved in wanting to read?
Yeah, I think... So I think definitely getting them involved, finding out about their identities. What do they like to do outside of school? So sometimes this is known as an everyday literacy. So when they go home, is there a certain shop that they walk past every day? Or do they take the train home? Or does granddad pick them up? Or their big sister or their big brother pick them up? What kind of conversations? What do they do on a weekend? Do they live in a rural area? Do they live in an urban area? What's the everyday experience? Do they have someone who reads a newspaper, or do they have someone who likes to do the crossword, or none of the above? And I think sometimes we go straight in with, what do you like? Oh, I like football, or I like pirates, or I like dinosaurs. But actually being able to tap into, okay, this child has a really strong relationship with granddad. Can I find a book that has a theme on a child and their relationship with granddad? And then what you can do, once you've found that you can springboard from that book. So maybe the child and granddad, I'm thinking of a book like Benji Davies' Granddad's Island. You might think of that, and that might springboard into some other Benji Davies works, or you might want to explore some other books that have those relationships, adult-child. So I think it's not just about those interests, those obvious interests that we would find out. That's one way. There are, on the Open University Reading for Pleasure website, there are some free surveys that you can use as well, which are fantastic.
Really useful.
Yeah, so you can survey your children to find out about their general interests, which are really useful. Also doing something like a reading river with the children and asking them to take that home to complete that with families. What a reading river is just looking at their reading over a period of time. What do you like to read? Where do you read? What kinds of reading materials do you have around you? Are there newspapers, magazines? Do you read the bus signs? Do you go to Morrison's and read the specials? I love those, the leaflets from Lidl and Aldi. They're brilliant, trawling through those kinds of things. What is it every day? So I think using some kind of formal tool like that is useful.
I think knowing for something like that, sorry to interrupt you, but to know what reading is, it's not just a book. I remember having the conversation with one of my own sons that they see me reading books and I've always got my Kindle on the go or whatever, but they don't see dad read. And I was like, well, dad likes to read the news every day, but he does it on his phone. We don't have a physical newspaper, but he reads a magazine. Like, well, that's not proper reading. Like, it is, it's still reading. He's still reading the text and enjoying it and getting something from it. But letting children know that actually any reading is, whether it's a recipe that while you're helping cook or reading the shopping list, it's all reading.
But if you think about the images that we see in media, social media, television, adverts, it's always someone reading a book in a really peaceful place, snuggled up with a cup of tea. It's usually a novel. It's very or it might be a Kindle or something like that. It's not often a magazine or it might be a newspaper. But I think it's having those conversations. I have 2 boys and they're very similar. My eldest child, he loves thriller novels or any kind of murder mysteries. In secondary school, he's very much into these kinds of Holly Jackson and all these books at the moment. And he straight away has just loved reading. But because he likes reading novels, he's always seen himself as a reader, because it's almost as he thinks, oh, well, this is an acceptable form of reading. Not a message I've given, of course, but something that he's seen.
Yeah.
Whereas my youngest son, he likes any kind of football magazine, cricket match reports. He likes Guinness records, Ripley's Believe It or Not, joke books.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, what are you going to read tonight? Oh, well, I'm not reading. I'm just looking at I'm just having a look at these jokes. Or I'm not reading. I'm not reading. I'm just. But actually, the more that we can share the message that reading is broader than just novels or what we consider to be the traditional forms, the more we can tap into those interests as well.
Yeah, and I think seeing teachers do a reading river as well of what I've read over the day or the week or whatever, and actually it's emails, it's notices, it's all these things, and making that clear to children, actually it's all reading. Yeah,
because it's, it is also about self-efficacy. So Ryan and Desi did some research on self-determination theory, and we think about our competence, so how good we are at reading, our autonomy, are we able to do it ourselves, and our relatedness, how much we're related to that. Their research wasn't specifically related to reading, but we can overlay it with reading. But I think it's that self-efficacy, and actually, is it something that I believe that I can do, is one of the biggest hurdles. And if you can find something to hook them in and help them, again, link to reader identity with, I don't think I'm a reader, to I might be a reader, or I'm not a reader, but I like this. That's showing those small steps that you're wanting to develop over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think graphic novels, the boom we've had in those in the recent years has been sort of a stepping stone, hasn't it, for getting some children that are reluctant readers, or like you say, don't see themselves as a reader, to I'm enjoying the graphic novel, and then we might progress into other forms of reading. But I think something like that doesn't feel overwhelming. Even though they're a nice story, they're not huge, thick novels. You can pick it up and feel like actually it's accessible and I can do this.
And also the accessibility of audiobooks as well. And I mean, just on the drive here, I was listening to The Wrong Shoes by Tom Percival.
Oh, I've just read it. Isn't it beautiful?
It is absolutely beautiful.
Loved it.
And I do like listening to an audiobook, but you don't have to pay for audiobook subscriptions necessarily through your local library. If you have a library card, you can borrow audiobooks, you can borrow ebooks. So sometimes, I know it's a big bugbear, screens, getting them off the screens, but sometimes instead of fighting the screens all the time, let's think about how we can integrate that into something that's going to encourage them to read. Because it might be that they hear Tom Percival on an audiobook, and then that encourages, they think, oh, actually, I really quite like that. They might be more willing to then read something else in a different form, or not. Maybe another audiobook might be what they prefer. But I think it's helping to recognize those identities, to craft those journeys that are going to help them feel successful.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, audiobooks. It's one of the things at the TRG that I run that we had a conversation about, are they reading or not? Because we're not looking at the text. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, audiobooks are great for getting the flow and the feel of the story. I mean, in terms of skill development, if you're thinking of skill development, it's very different because they're not seeing the text at the same time. But for hearing the pace of the story, the empathy, the connection with the characters, the story arc, the flow, I think absolutely. If audiobooks is where they like to read, even if it's certain books that they like on audio. Like I was listening to Tom Percival today, but usually I listen to nonfiction on audio because I just can't cope with reading something that just hits me with a bunch of facts because I just can't remember it. Whereas if I hear it, it somehow makes a bit more sense. Whereas I like to usually read different things. So again, it's the
Yeah.
different ways we like to read and the different ways we like to access information.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I've never had a non-fiction audiobook. I've always gone for fiction. If I'm going for a run, I'll, pop the headphones in and I'll have a story as I'm going to, distract me from the fact that I'm tired and I want to stop. But I've never really looked at a non-fiction audiobook.
Biographies are good for that.
Yes.
Yeah, because they're more like stories, but
yes.
telling the biography, usually sometimes told in a that voice where you can really feel the emotion, is really quite powerful.
Yeah, definitely. So have you got any top tips for a school who thinks, actually, we've not done an awful lot on reading for pleasure? We've started having a little look, we've thrown some really old tatty books out of the library away. So we've done a bit of culling and got rid of that. It's a really hard thing to do, isn't it? We've got a book that we've paid money for and that children have loved, but now it needs to go. So we've done a little bit of that. We've got some new books. What would be your sort of top tips for how to make a good start?
Yeah. So I'd say first and foremost, get to know your readers. It's like, for instance, if someone says, "Can I make you dinner?" and they don't know that you're a vegetarian, and you serve them a lovely steak. It's a lovely dinner. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
But it's not
for them.
It's the same thing if you set up your this beautiful library and it's not really attuned to what the children might want or how they might be how they might like to access that library. So get to know your readers. The more that you know them, the more you can curate those social spaces, those physical spaces, the more you can listen and gently nudge and encourage that, charging up of that power grid and building that solar power in the long term. I'd say also part of that is activating the peer networks. So we were talking earlier about this, weren't we? If we know that we have pupils who are a bit more reluctant to read or perhaps have a negative self-perception of themselves as a reader, how can I find those tendrils, those network threads that are existing and help to tap them in to a particular network? Is it a graphic novels club? Is it perhaps they love spoken word poetry, or maybe they really like funny books or joke books? There will be someone else in the class, in the school, adult or child, that they can network with, and those networks will expand and grow. And then finally, coupled with that, it's just keeping your collections fresh and relevant, being aware of those contemporary authors, a range of authors, different diverse backgrounds, different diverse voices, I think is so essential, because children want to be able to see themselves reflected in books, but also it gives them an opportunity to experience the lives of others, develop those skills of empathy, and to open up interesting conversations. So, Teresa always says we want old in gold and new in bold in our collection. So I'd say those would be my 3 top tips.
So how can schools continue to buy books? I don't know if this is something that you've talked about before, but obviously school budgets are quite tight at the moment, with lots of, funding's tight all over the country in all walks of life, isn't it? So school budgets are tight. Books are beautiful, but they're not always cheap.
Yes.
How can schools continue to have that renewed books coming through?
We do on the Open University Reading for Pleasure site. If you go onto the website and search Finding and Funding, we do have a document on the website that gives suggestions of different places where you can appeal for funding for different kinds of books.
Definitely one to look out for.
Yes, definitely. Have a look for that. Also, it's things like having book fairs, having different challenges. Again, some of those extrinsic, mains power, but actually in the short term, but also things like
sponsored read, that kind of
sponsored reads, but also book swap days where the child can bring in something from home that they've read and they've really enjoyed. Could be a magazine, could be a book, could be a newspaper. You set up a table outside of school in the morning, in the afternoon, bring in a book that you've loved and swap it for something else. There's no money involved. Nothing has to be costed at all. I can bring a book. I can bring 2 books. I might not bring any, because I might not have any books at home. But I know that there are some books here available. It gets families involved. They can come into the school and have those conversations. And even better if the adults in the school are there as well and they're having those conversations. Because when we're encouraging reading for pleasure, not only in school, but at home, it's 2-way conversation. And it's not just the school talking to home about what they could do. Actually, what are the practices at home, those everyday literacies that we talked about earlier? What are those practices that we can support and tap into at school as well? Sometimes you'll find that children read more at home than they do in school, or perhaps they might read more in school than they do at home. So finding ways to bridge that gap can be quite helpful.
Yeah, lovely. Oh, it's been fabulous talking to you, Kelly. Thank you. But
Sarah?
I can't let you go without asking, what's your favourite children's book?
Oh my goodness, my favorite children's book.
Or a top 3 if you can't narrow it down.
Oh, do you know, I love a funny book. So anything from John Klassen. I Want My Hat Back.
Yes.
And The Rock That Fell from the Sky. I love a good laugh. Everyone knows on the team, I love a really funny book. I'm also really into Sarah Krasan. So she writes verse novels for older readers. And there's one about, it's called One, about conjoined twins, which sounds quite an interesting one. So I do some book reviewing and different things as well. And I came across Sarah Krasan's work and her books, and The Weight of Water, that's another one. Also anything, of course, by Tom Percival. He's just one of my favorite. I think he really gets it. For American authors, again, it has to be Kate DiCamillo because of Winn-Dixie and all of her other fantastic, Raimi Nightingale, Louisiana's Way Home.
Yeah, beautiful ones.
Because I feel really connected to those stories because she writes from a place where I grew up. Yeah. So when she's writing because of Winn-Dixie, I had a Winn-Dixie down the street when I was growing up. And I think
you've got that connection already to it.
Yes, absolutely. So as soon as I read that book, I was hooked. And that's what we want for our readers. We want them to find something in a book, in an audiobook, that really gets them, that makes them want to choose to read, and over time forms that habit.
Yeah, lovely. Well, thank you for joining us today, Kelly. If you want to get involved with anything Reading for Pleasure, please visit our website. You can now get involved in our next cohort of the Transforming Schools Reading Culture if Reading for Pleasure is something that you're developing in your school at the moment. Please do also look out for our teacher reading groups that we run in conjunction with the Open University and UKLA. But please also do check out the Open University Reading for Pleasure website with all the lovely resources that Kelly's referred to already today. Thanks for joining us.